All right. Well, hello everybody and welcome to our Day in the Life series with a continued focus on the Director of Finance and Operations, also known as Director of Finance and Administration. My name is Dario Albiar Carmona, and I am the Human Resources Manager for the School of Engineering. I'm also going to be the facilitator for today's conversation. As a reminder, the purpose of the Day in the Life series was to spotlight a variety of roles across the university and really help to take some of the mystery out of those roles in terms of how they serve the university, the skills required to be successful, and the diverse career paths individuals have taken to these roles. And so in our previous conversation, we invited 3 DFOs to come in and share insights. However, we thought the discussion would be incomplete if we really didn't take into account to hear from the very individuals who play a very vital role in identifying, hiring, and managing DFOs in their schools. And these are the Senior Associate Deans of Finance and Administration. I have 3 of them joining me here today. Directly to my right is Amy Balsam from the School of Earth. Next to her is Steve Olson from Humanities and Sciences. And then to my left here is Scott Calvert from School of Engineering. Welcome to all 3 of you. Excited to have you all here.
Thank you.
Before we jump into our first question, I want to cover just a little bit of ground on the structure of today's conversation with our panel here. So to begin, I'm going to start with a few questions that I've selected to get our conversation rolling. And then as we kind of enter in that last 15 to 20 minute window of our time together here, of our hour together, I'm going to switch gears and just open it up to answering some of the questions that may have been posed by our virtual audience throughout our conversation today. We have a virtual moderator who's going to be collecting those questions, and then we'll have them available to ask. And depending on number of questions, we'll get to as many as we possibly can within the time constraints that we have available. That said, the session is also being recorded, so if at any point in time you need to step away, you'll have access to this later on to be able to see the rest of the conversation. Also, being that it is recorded, we would ask that everyone do their best to ensure we maintain the sound quality and the video quality as best as possible. If you need to take a call or you need to have a side conversation, that you just step away with from whatever device that you're accessing this conversation. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and jump into our first question for our panel. So welcome again to all 3 of you. Happy to have you all here. This first question is for all of you, and Steve, I'll start with you, and then we'll work our way around over to Scott here. But just to begin with, and to kind of give us all a little bit of context, give us a little just either kind of background around your organizations, and in particular, how the DFO role kind of fits inside of that organization, how it operates in your school, and in your relationship to that role as well. So, Steve,
sure.
I'll start with you.
So in School of Humanities and Sciences, we have 23 departments. We have a lot of other things too, but the DFO role is specifically for departments. The DFO is the administrative head on the ground. That's the person in the department who is responsible for sort of all the operations, administrative functions within the department, obviously working directly with the chair and faculty. The individual heads up the staff, whatever staffing there is in that department. Works very closely with our dean's office. All of our functional heads work very closely with them, from finance to HR, research administration is appropriate, facilities, etc. I have dotted line reporting responsibility for these roles as well as about 30, 35 others. So on the one hand, that's wonderful because there is this dotted line. There's a solid line report to the chair for each of the DFOs. But because at HS we have so many wonderful parts, that line can get pretty thin, and we really rely so heavily on that leadership at the local level. It's critical that we have somebody basically in charge of the administrative function who can execute the vision and the goals of the department and work collaboratively with the dean's office.
Thanks. So in the School of Earth, very similar to H&S, the Director of Finance and Operations is the point person, I'd say the hub of a wheel of activity in the department. I expect that that DFO to partner very closely with the department chair as well as with the dean's office. That relationship between the chair and the DFO is really critical because often the DFO is the continuity. Chairs turn over every 3 to 6 years if we can get them to do 2 terms. Having that person be high skill and be really well respected and well regarded both locally amongst the faculty and staff in the department as well as with colleagues in the dean's office is critical. And like Steve, we really rely on those people to know what's going on and to actually issue spot, let us know, bring us in when things happen.
Fantastic. Scott?
So School of Engineering has 10 DFOs in 9 departments and 1 institute. As Steve described, they report solid line to their chairs and dotted line to me. And all of the DFO jobs are big jobs in the School of Engineering. We don't have any small departments, and we have some really large departments. And when I think about the DFO, they're a generalist, handling almost everything that goes on in a department. Our departments have a pretty high degree of autonomy in the way they do their business, in the way they commit resources, in the execution of both the research and the education mission. I think the sort of thumbnail expectation that I have for all the DFOs is to be a strategic business partner to that chair who's got an academic vision in mind, but as we all know, there's a lot to carry that out, right? And I wanted to see those 2 people working hand in hand at a strategic level.
And I think it's worth pointing out too, and it's a good point Scott makes it, one thing that's a little bit unique about H&S is we really do have quite a spectrum of departments, the size of departments. Just on the staffing side, it's one department has as few as 2 or 3 staff, and others have over 100. So unlike engineering, there's quite a range, which actually is great for career development because there's sort of more of what I call an entry level for a first the DFO job, and then an ability to progress or move on to other schools in your career.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just fill in because I didn't mention that in Stanford Earth we have 4 departments and 3 IDPs. So the program directors or program managers are very similar to the department managers. And we should also say that we are using terms somewhat interchangeably, department manager, DFO, DFA. The opportunity to move amongst the schools, I think, is it's facilitated really by the fact that we have so many different sizes. And people there are some opportunities to grow and to start and grow with complexity because some of these organizations are very large and very complex.
Excellent. And I think one of the things I'll want to get into is talking about that mobility for DFO, because I'm sure that there's definitely going to be some interest about, well, what does that mobility look like? I certainly want to talk about that. But let's take it back to really the beginning. As you're looking at potential candidates here, and Amy, my next question is I want to start with you on this, which is, as you're looking for someone to step into a DFO role, and I know that there can be a bit of variance in terms of context of that role, but generally speaking, are there specific skills or competencies that you look for when recruiting for candidates, and can you speak to those?
So I think many people have heard me say this, but I think there's sort of 3 critical components, and one has 3 parts. The first is being smart, nice, and flexible. I think those qualities are critical. Problem-solving skills and the ability to issue spot. And it's really so important that those qualities are there, because if you're smart, you can hopefully learn anything, and you have to be flexible to work in this environment. Absolutely. And I think Stanford has a very interpersonal, personal relationship focus, and so I think it's important for people to be nice. I don't really know how else to say it. So So those are sort of for me, those are the top.
Gotcha. So so I hear a couple things when you talk about SMART. One of the things I'm hearing is just it's having almost this like mental agility to be able to say, okay, I have to be in a constant open mode to learn things that are going to be out of my element, or have to step outside of my comfort zone because one situation isn't necessarily going to line up to the next one.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, every day is a new day, I would say, for the three of us, as well as a DFO. Being able to be agile, not be too afraid of something new coming down the road that you haven't addressed before. Actually finding that invigorating and exciting is really quite critical. And the problem solving can't be underestimated. Again, this is a very complicated place to work.
Yeah.
So in all problems, basically, if problems first go to the DFOs, and if they can't get solved there, then they come to us. So we really hope that they can get solved. So yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned there was one other thing that you talked about, which was the issue spot.
Issue spotting.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or can you talk a little bit more about that?
I'm hoping these guys can help, but I would say issue spotting is a very nuanced capability, and I will say if you think something's wrong and your antenna is starting to go up, don't ignore it. That's when you raise your hand, you find me or your supervisor, and you say, I think something doesn't seem right here. You know, whether it's a faculty member getting a corporate gift from a company that you know their students often work at. You know, just these things that may not seem quite right.
Yeah.
So so judgment is maybe top of my list. I
Judgment.
agree with everything
Yeah.
you said, and I'm sure I'll agree with everything Scott says. There are other things too, and I think that's at the same point. I think of it as judgment because there are many decisions that need to be made on a daily basis, and most of them seem small and are relatively small. But they're important.
Until
Do you want to make it right? But there are some decisions, and we've all been there, that you think is a pretty small decision, and you haven't thought through all of the ramifications. And that's, I think, part of what you're saying. It's judgment, it's having a good sniff test, and you get that over time.
Yeah.
But to kind of know, in this situation with that individual, based on some history, which, this could maybe blow up in a way, like when to keep the chair, in our case, the dean, informed is a judgment call. You don't want to just burden your busy faculty supervisor with things. So those sorts of things of knowing when to pull the right people in, when to reach out to the dean's office, exactly, or your central resources. So I think that's
it's the same.
exactly what you're
I
saying.
just add one little bit more flavor, I guess. When I think about the DFO job, right, there's no one that's an expert in everything, right? And you're not going to understand the letter of the policy and everything that you're responsible for as a DFO. So it's that issue spotting and that judgment, right, to apply good common sense framework to things that you may not even completely understand, right?
Right, exactly. And in fact, to sort of this question of SMART,
Yeah.
It's not about the degree you have. In fact, I think we have all been in situations where an applicant might have a PhD in the discipline that they're going to have applied for a job in. That's actually not what we're looking for necessarily, most often not.
I'd say there are very few examples, and I think back to
Mario. Right.
Mario's a good example that worked out well.
Right.
But he explained that wasn't what made him successful.
Right, exactly.
So in kind of on the, this and on a related note, Scott, I want to take this question to you, which is, how does this show for you as you're looking at resumes and cover letters? How do you see some of these things, or what is it that you see that might speak to someone's potential capability? Because obviously you really don't know until someone steps into the role, but in the early phase there, as you're kind of looking at credentials on a piece of paper.
So yeah, kind of what are my must-haves?
Yeah, what are the flags, the good flags that you see that come up?
So first off, I want to reiterate that we have these, when you look at a DFO job and sort of the list of things that you're going to be responsible for, right, I'd never go in with any, misconception that I'm going to find somebody that knows everything there. And in fact, yeah, I mean, those people are few and far between, and they're probably not, who I'm going to hire anyway. So that's number one, is everybody's not going to tick every box.
No one is going to tick every box. Yeah.
For me, the biggest must-have is management experience. As we talked about, the size of the School of Engineering departments, none of those is an entry-level management job. It can't be the first time you've managed people. There are just too many responsibilities and too many moving parts, so I have to have someone who has managed before. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have managed in any particular environment, but you need to at least have experience being a people manager. And then I guess my other must-have is you have to have had responsibility for financial resources. And I don't mean, that you have to know the Stanford accounting systems or Oracle or those kinds of things. That doesn't even mean that you were a financial approver, so, that means that you're okay. I want someone who's had to manage some financial resources and make decisions based on that, make some resource allocation decisions, because DFOs, even at a place like Stanford, the resources are not limitless, and the needs are, right? And so one of the things that a DFO does is make these sort of what I think of as strategic resource allocation decisions. And I think if you haven't been in that position, at least in one of the School of Engineering departments, that's going to be overwhelming to learn on the job. Now, all I'm looking for is some exposure. It doesn't need to be at the scale. If you're in electrical engineering and you've got a $65 million consolidated budget, I'm not looking for someone who's managed that much money, but I am looking for someone who's had to make some decisions around money, not just go, yeah, this is an okay expense.
And you also talked earlier about, the nature of this job is a big job. Specifically, someone really needs to be able to operate autonomously. They need to be that strategic business partner. I'm assuming that kind of the financial acumen here speaks a bit to the strategic component that someone needs to have coming into this. Is there anything else?
Yeah, well, certainly, we call it Director of Finance and Operations because it's a very accurate description, right? And when I think about the things that the academic leaders understand, they understand an end state that they want to achieve, whether it's research or education, but they may not know how to get the people, money, things, all aligned and working together. So, when I really think about what a DFO is doing, yeah, money's a tool, right? But it's really understanding what the work is and how to get the resources, whether that's, just number of people, whether that's a skill set, whether it's time, how to organize a group of people to get the work done, right? That ultimately becomes the challenge. And it's, again, these are maybe idealistic terms because it might not feel like that in the day-to-day fires, but I think every DFO, if they step back, would think, yeah, that's really what I'm doing, is I'm managing a bunch of people to get a bunch of work done.
What about, and this would be something that'd be interested for all of you to chime in on. So we had someone ask, what's the interview experience like coming in for someone new as this? And what might be some of the questions that, and I imagine they kind of speak to some of these things that you're looking for, but what are some of the examples of questions that you ask someone and what might they experience or anticipate if they're coming to interview for a DFO role?
So I could start by just even explaining what it looks like in the School of Engineering.
Sure. Okay.
So I run every DFO search myself, and that's a partnership that I have with the chair of a department, and so I have to get them to buy in to how I'm going to run that search. But my bargain to a chair is that I'm going to vet a bunch of candidates, and they will all be above the bar. what that bar is. Of course, I can't perfectly define for them, but it's in my mind. And they're ultimately going to make the final choice, right? Because there's a solid line relationship between the DFO and the chair, and so the chair is the actual hiring manager, 51% of the vote in the School of Engineering. And of course, I try and influence that a great deal, but in the end, the chair is going to make the decision. And so my process is involved to build a very small number of candidates, ideally 2 to 3, that meet the standards and can be the strategic business partner. So, like I said, I run the search myself. I read all the cover letters and resumes of every single applicant. I decide who I'm going to screen. I do the initial screenings, and that usually turns out to be some number, 8, 10 people. And then I actually turn that whole process over to what I think are more on-the-ground experts, and that's a panel, typically made up of 2 to 3 of the dean's office functional directors, always HR, and then whether it's finance, facilities, IT, research administration, it's one of those, and we kind of just rotate that duty around, and finance is always on it. And then typically 2 DFOs, so sitting DFOs, right? So you get the functional perspective, and you get then the generalist perspective. Those people do a combined set of interviews. The finance interview is very finance specific. We typically ask people to bring in some example of financial things that they've worked on, and it could be anything from training that you did to a business problem that you analyzed, or if you have any sort of current work, you can anonymize it in any way. We work that out, but they bring that in and talk the finance folks through that, so we assess their sort of how do they think about managing money, essentially. And then all the other folks really focus more on competencies. How do you go about problem solving? How do you manage people? And we're very focused on how do you develop people, those kinds of things. And through that process, again, I tip the scales here with 51% of the vote over my committee. We come to that short pool, and then I hand them over to the department, where the chair will typically do a personal interview. They'll meet with key stakeholders. They'll have the opportunity to meet some subset of the staff, depending on how big the staff is. If it's 100 people, it's not all of them. Ultimately, I try and set that up so that the chair, can get comfortable and make a decision.
Yeah. Fantastic. Steve, Amy, just as far as I know that Scott covered quite a wide range in terms of the process.
Scott took a long time.
It's very thorough, and I think that's extremely insightful. But do the processes in your schools differ in any way, or are they very comparable to kind of what Scott has described?
Comparable, not exactly the same, but comparable. Try to have involvement of a couple of the existing DFOs, some functional area leadership. I'm maybe a little heavier handed actually in advancing a candidate. I've had situations where the chair and I did not agree, and I learned long ago that if I deferred to the chair and that didn't work out, that became my problem. And so I learned to, I guess, if I can't get at least 2 candidates above that bar, then I hand them one.
Oh, yes, I do too, right. I only advance candidates I can live with.
Yeah, right, right, so.
Yeah, I'd say it's well, the big difference is that our HR managers, we have HR managers for each of our clusters, and they actually manage the process. Exact same goals and pretty much the same people involved. We have other DFOs interviewing. We have always have finance and HR participating in the interview process. our goal, again, and can't say enough, is I don't want anyone going before the chair, and usually it's a faculty committee, it's usually maybe the chair and 2 other faculty from the department. I don't want anybody going before them that we already don't think is above the bar. It's a very bad position to be in. And so I'm much less involved. It's interesting. Certainly I participate in the interview process, one-on-one and extensive time in person, and express my opinion. As I said, we sit down with the chair at the end. We would not want, if only people clearly above the bar are going to go before the faculty.
So last point that I want to make, just kind of in terms of the overall kind of recruitment process and so forth. I know earlier, and I agree with this, which is, just because you have perhaps a particular degree or certification, that's not all that's necessarily, that's great, but that's definitely not going to guarantee your success in the role. That said, are there, because this was a question that was asked, but are there any kinds of either certifications or classes that might look a little more favorable upon a candidate in terms of their overall body of experience that might just kind of tip things slightly in their favor, or might get their resume more noticed by
I gotta say, what most important, what we're looking for, as you can kind of tell, we're looking for people who have these really important people skills.
Sure.
And actually, I would throw in, I didn't put this in before, but somebody who can quickly build relationships and establish trust. Honestly, if you have good judgment, you can do that. You're a kind of a creative, thoughtful learner, you're going to do just fine in these roles. I would say project management is a skill set. Finance for sure, we look for that. But if you're looking at a resume, I would say, and we've talked about this recently with some of our DFOs about what are the core, what makes someone successful. And we said, they have finance experience and project management broadly defined. It could be putting on a big event from start to finish and proving that. And you'd asked about the questions that it might be asked. And I guess the one thing I'd say, you're going to get asked all kinds of questions. That's fine. We're used to that. Specific answers are really important. I think where people get tripped up is when they try to be really general. And the kind of people who are involved in this process interviewing want to hear, it doesn't have to be the perfect answer, but we all go through that when we interview, is you have to be able to pivot and pull something real and detailed to pull out. So I'd say that'd be my advice to anybody who's going into the interview process, is really think across your career, what things are you proud of? Where did you, build trust, execute from A to Z,
Overcome a
deliver a project,
challenge.
Exactly. That's the kind of thing that I think really resonates with the people who are interviewing. And I'm sorry, Dario, the exact question was.
No, I think
and
I think that's just it. I think thematically, I think what rings loud and clear is that the quality of someone's experience is absolutely top. That's going to be the top consideration.
But you're talking about what
But like
sort
But
of,
if there's, I know some people do ask of ours, like,
what
is there a degree, or is there a training, or is there a kind of a
I have some thoughts on this.
Yeah.
For me, there's not one particular thing when you say project management, that of course rings a bell for me, because it speaks to sort of a methodical approach to things and sort of the ability to keep track of multiple variables at the same time. But if you're thinking about a master's in higher education, if you're thinking about an MBA, if you're thinking about PMP certification, I think any of those things are good. I don't think they're necessary, and so my advice, if you're thinking about one of these things, don't do it for the credential, because that isn't going to matter. But if it's something you care about and you go and have a rich educational experience, that's going to mean something to you and be something that you can draw on later, then I say all in on those things. I personally, when I was transitioning careers, went and got an MBA. Is that required to do my job? No. But I personally got a lot out of it that I've leaned on from time to time. But I don't think that when Jim Plummer hired me to be the senior associate dean, he cared whether or not I had an MBA. And I don't look at somebody's credentials and go yes or no. But if someone comes to me and talks to me in an interview about the things they got out of that,
And what motivated them to do it.
then that means something to me, right? So it's not just the thing on the paper. Don't waste your time and money, because they're expensive. But if it's something you're vested in and you're going to put your heart into, then I say any of those
I
things.
agree. I mean, amen to that. I think that's well said. I would say the other thing is I'm always impressed when people have done something. When and it doesn't have to be education, right? It could be I volunteered when the opportunity came up to be part of a task force to look at process improvement and blah, blah, blah in your area, or I sat on the student services, whatever committee. That stands out. Maybe more so than somebody getting some sort of certification necessarily, although that's impressive too. But it really is showing that you are a continuous learner, that you want to grow, because in these jobs, as Scott said, and I think Amy Tucker, I guess too, even if you have already been a DFO in another department, there's a huge learning curve. There's a learning curve after year 5. And so if you're not embracing the fact that we are on a journey and we need to continue to grow, then that's a problem. So I love to see that people have taken a lot of initiative.
So when you think about that showing up on a resume, that's so on the head, right? If you've sought out, been given a stretch assignment and actually done something and participated in something, that steps a little bit outside your job. I mean, not only is that a way to personally develop yourself, but it is a way to stand out.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that it also, again, going back to this space is very personal relationship driven, and having sort of caring about the community and going out of your way to volunteer for a task force or a working group or an advisory group. I'm willing to test a piece of software, whatever. Putting yourself out there and trying to better the institution is actually also very, it's eye-catching in that way.
So so I think it's really enlightening to hear that, these things are, when we talk about like formal certifications and degrees, and they might speak to someone's, ongoing desire to expand their knowledge and continue to put themselves in a new space to learn, which is certainly kind of a nice way to demonstrate that ability that's here. We're also hearing too is other things that may not necessarily show up that way, but might be bodies of work that they involve themselves if they're here at the university, certainly different task force that they may serve on that serve the community.
Yeah. Volunteer work.
Yeah.
So I think it is very important, and I do think that a lot of Stanford staff feel like, oh, I don't have the right finance background, and I haven't done this, and I haven't done that, and I think what we're all saying is that skills are developed in all sorts of venues, and what you have to be able to do is articulate how you can transfer those skills, how they're applicable.
Yeah, I think that if there was one, and I think there's many, but the one big takeaway is that last point there, which is being prepared to articulate how you're able to transfer that experience and how it applies itself to the DFO role.
Yeah.
So I want to move us kind of along this timeline that we're on where, okay, so, and Steve, I want to direct this next question to you, onboarding. So a DFO starts, what?
Curveball.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, here's the deep end, here you go. But yeah, what might an onboarding process or experience be in the first 90 days, with like 30, 60, 90 in a lot of organizations. But what might be that experience they would encounter coming into, HNS?
So actually, if you asked me 4 years ago, it would have been good luck. Here's a life vest. And no, just kidding. But we have in the last few years really formalized a process. I have to say that interesting thing about the DFOs, we have 23 of them. They don't always, sometimes they talk about how hard the job is, but they don't leave. They for whatever, and I think that's a good sign that those jobs, even though they're challenging, are really rewarding. They retire, and we have had of our 23 in the last 4 years, we've had 8. We've had 6 retirements, but 2 promotions up. So we've had 8 open positions, and so we took that opportunity to, out of necessity, really think about onboarding, and so we do things such as connecting with a formal mentor and have some structure around that. We always had sort of an informal process. We make sure, I personally meet with somebody in the first, every month at least. I do meet with all the DFOs. We have 23 of them, but a couple times a year. And we have group meetings too. And we've created clusters of DFOs who we will pay for lunch to get them together so they have a cohort. But they meet regularly with our functional leads, We are developing, we just had a meeting this morning, a internal sort of calendar and sort of landing page, which is specific, it's designed generally to help our department and program leads, but specifically for new people, so that you can kind of get a sense of the annual calendar's like, where key resources are. But I do have to say, so we try really hard. All of my senior directors, I'll meet with them. It will be a very challenging first year. I mean, I think just like most jobs, especially when you are the lead administrator on the ground,
When you're top of the org chart.
it is, you're right, and you're going to be learning all the new, even if you're being promoted from within, it's going to be a challenge. And so that's one of the reasons, having, resilience is another really important skill.
And a sense of humor.
Yeah, and being, being proactive and being able to reach out when you need help, because sometimes we want to put on a strong front, and I've seen that, and then I find out later that maybe they are struggling a little bit. So when I check in with them, they want to make it sound like everything's going well. I'd love to hear what other people do too, but what's hard about it is that every department is a little different.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to, and if you're lucky, your predecessor has left you their sort of cheat sheet of how to do the job, but that isn't always the case.
I think that's, the university does not do a good job of onboarding into these positions. So I'm impressed that you have a program. I have such a small unit and low turnover that we haven't developed anything that's you can put your hands on. I have the luxury of meeting with my DFOs weekly. And so when they're new, I meet with them weekly, and then I move to twice a month or once a month, depending on how they're doing. And then I actually set up and make sure that they're meeting with the functional leads, director of finance, facilities, IT, fairly consistently in their first year. But it is, and you can't you can't possibly tell them everything or even 25% of what they need to know, because it's overwhelming, and they're not going to need to know that random policy until they stumble upon it, which gets back to the issue spotting, judgment issue, because there's just too much.
Sure.
But the folks who do really well are ones who are really skilled at reaching out and identifying key people and contact and cultivating those relationships, whether it's with the dean's office, with their colleagues, with colleagues in other departments. Sometimes you don't want to show your colleagues within your school that you're struggling, but to connect with somebody in another school where it's a little safer, perhaps a little more distance. But those are the ones who really do well, because they're able to, they're more resourceful.
Cast the net, so to speak.
Yeah.
So our onboarding looks, I have the luxury of meeting, I don't meet with the existing DFOs on a weekly basis, but I meet with the new ones on a weekly basis, just like you do, and then we taper that down as they need to, and they meet very regularly with finance and HR.
They meet with HR all the time.
And then a little bit less with the other functional leaders, but with all of them. I also assign an existing DFO mentor. But the thing I would say, so very similar, ours is pretty structured, but the thing that isn't structured is I'm not checking up on them other than when they come to meet with me. So I explain right up, all right, here are the things you're gonna do, but okay, boss, because you're the boss now, you need to make sure you're doing these things. So again, it goes back to the people we look to hire, but a new DFO has to take a lot of ownership in making sure that their own onboarding goes well. And you alluded to that certainly with the people that take the initiative to reach out. But we provide the roadmap, but they're the ones who have to follow it, right? I'm not holding somebody's hand going, did you meet with?
Right. And it's not and there's not a recipe.
No.
At all.
No.
It's not one step after another. You really do have to be able to be live on your feet. And
It really, because that depends very much on the academic/business cycle where you start. Because Amy said, you're going to learn something new every single day for at least a year, and then you're gonna relearn some of those things.
3. I think it takes 3 years.
Okay.
So I'm going to take a quick, I have one more question, but before we do that, I want to take a quick pause and just try to check to see if we've received any questions from online, and getting the indication that we haven't, but yeah, it looks like, and we have not received any questions at this time. So I've got one question that I know that we're all we all talked a little bit earlier, that I think it's going to be important to get to hear from all of you on. And it's this question of, would you consider hiring someone into a DFO role that currently works in a business unit, has never worked in a school? And if so, what might be some of the titles that translate well potentially that are out there? Obviously, there's more to it than the title, but just kind of at the onset. And are there any experience gaps that you would be concerned about for candidates with this type of background? So, Scott, I'll start with you, and then we'll work our way around the table here.
So thanks for asking. And yeah, I'm absolutely gonna look to hire somebody that might be in a central business unit. And I say that because I've also hired people from outside Stanford. And I guess I'll say one of the reasons we're having this series is that there's not an obvious path to being a DFO. It's a generalist. And so we're going to find people from lots of different sort of career trajectories, and hopefully somewhere along the way they've accumulated the kinds of things that we talked about. So I'm super open to hiring folks from outside, from business units, or I would love to have a path from in the school to becoming a DFO. But even with the size of the School of Engineering, that's not that feasible, right? Because as you've heard, it takes a variety of experiences, I think, to be ready for one of these jobs. And so there's no real path that I can imagine, from starting as, say, an administrative associate, staying in the same department and becoming the DFO someday, right? That just, I don't see I don't see the breadth of opportunities there. And so, for me, I'm looking for people that have had, a variety of experiences, because that's what builds this job. And, I think, if I think about someone from a business unit, they, in my mind, obviously have a step up on external candidates already, right? Because they know something about the Stanford culture. If you're in a business unit and you're thinking about one of these jobs, try and get some exposure to working with faculty. In whatever kind of, in one-on-one, on a committee, whatever the opportunity is, because there's a different mindset and a different set of expectations. Their careers evolve in a different way, and so having some exposure to the way of thinking, the things that they think are problems that need solving, I think is a huge leg up for anybody. Frankly, there will be fewer surprises if you've had that kind of exposure. But again, I've hired people successfully, who haven't worked even in academia before, so I'm open to it.
Yeah, Amy, what's your thought on this?
Very similar to Scott's. I absolutely have hired people from business units into DFO roles. In fact, Sheila was in OSR before she was department manager for me.
She works for me now.
And but I think it goes back to what Scott was saying earlier, management experience. It's okay if you don't have domain expertise specifically, but you have to have had management experience. So all the better for me. I actually really like being able to hire people who've been in business units at Stanford. They understand the machinations and how that other half of the campus works. They can often actually expedite and get things sort of done. They know who to call in FMS, or they know who to call in OSR. So that to me is a real benefit, and And I know this doesn't happen as often, but when staff on the academic side go into business units, I think it just helps enrich and improve how the university runs. I think we're more apt to solve problems more effectively if we understand both sides of the coin. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's I think as I listen to that, and I think about some of the organizations that I've worked for before. I worked for a really large retailer, and I actually got the experience of working both in the kind of the headquarters operation, but then also working in the field as well. And it is an entirely different perspective. And when I first started at Stanford, just in my own career, I started in a business unit, and knew and been told that if you get into a school, it's just, again, it's an entirely different world. Actually, I think you and I have had that conversation about that. But just it does, to see both sides of the coin and have I think that perspective is extremely rich.
Yeah.
So.
Stanford's a richer place for the cross-pollinization
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, as challenging as it can be, but certainly definitely richer place.
Yeah.
Steve, what about you?
So, I mean, yeah, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said in the scenario. I mean, I'm a huge advocate and proponent of people moving from central units to academic units. That I did it myself. I thought having come from academic unit to the budget office, I brought that perspective, which was really helpful when I went into this sort of role. It was really beneficial. I'm all for it. I think that's how it is. I will say this and so I did look back at the 8 hires we've done. There was one person who was external, but had been basically DFO. And 2 of our peer institutions back east, and also had done a temporary assignment here at Stanford, so she was quasi-internal. And the other 7 all came from within H&S. So full disclosure,
Wow.
I don't think we do a very good job of hiring. On the other hand, I do a lot of informational interviews, and there's a tremendous amount of talent. Not everybody applies. Actually, I have to say, I have a lot of informational interviews, and I think there's I think it's harder in H&S, honestly, because as you can kind of tell, because have so many units, they are more isolated. I would love to be able to meet one-on-one with, weekly or even monthly with my DFOs. We get a lot of FaceTime, but it's often more group setting. Because of that, they are on the ground, a little more siloed, and faculty chairs, especially in a smaller department where you don't necessarily have if you have 3 student services officers and a manager and 2 others, it's a little different than saying you basically either have one person who maybe is
Jack of all trades.
Yeah. And so the smaller the unit gets, the more the faculty really are uncomfortable with somebody who does not have experience and can't check those boxes. And part of my job when I meet with them is say, we don't have to check all the boxes. They don't have to have done a faculty search. I didn't when I first went into a school. I read the manual. It's project management. But so that's on us too. But I would say that in H&S, in the smaller departments, it is a heavier lift to be able to articulate to a faculty chair at that point. It's easier with me, I get it. But it is a little harder to explain why the work that you've done in a central unit would translate to this generalist position. Mm-hmm. So it's just to be totally candid. I think there's tremendous, we would be closing the door to a ton of talent if we didn't not just invite people, but sort of recruit folks to do that. I would say an alternative is to go into a dean's office. That's an easier, to me, that's even an easier move. If you're in a central unit, go into a dean's office, and then from a dean's office to a department eliminates one of the hurdles, because now you're sort of a known entity within a school. You have that academic experience. You work with
You've been on
faculty leadership.
the evil side. You've been in the dean's office.
Right, that's true. Right, that's right.
The dark,
Coming
yeah.
from budget
We've had a
office to
couple
school
of staff
is a
coming
tough
from
hurdle.
departments up to the dean's office, and it's like, ooh, you went over to the dark side.
But I would say, and what I tell people is, look, interview. I could say this to everybody. Please apply, interview. You're going to meet a lot of really interesting people, and you're going to get exposure to people like ourselves, to administrator, to functional leads within schools. It's a great way to network and to find out. And you would know through the interview process. You may, run kicking and screaming and saying, "There's no way I want to do the job." You may just think this is perfect for me, and even if this doesn't work out, how can I make myself more competitive so I can get one of those roles? So if anyone's watching, I know people, I'm sure, but I would very much encourage people to go through a application interview process if you're even remotely interested.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I know we're coming to the last 10 minutes. I want to wrap on one last question. and for each of you here, and then we'll go ahead and close out. But that is just kind of how you either perceive or measure success for a DFO in their role. Like, what does a successful DFO, like, let's say they get in, they get established, they're kind of off to the races. What does success look like, or measure, kind of measure up to in your perspective as an SAD? These people.
So it's a fuzzy one. I'm going to apologize for that up front. A successful DFO has figured out how to work with their chair. And that doesn't mean they have to like their chair or they always agree with their chair, but they work with their chair. It's really gross measurements, but that you can tell through the functional areas, right? If the people in their departments are functioning well, right? If their student services is clicking, it doesn't mean that, they necessarily know anything about student services yet, but they're at least creating the conditions, for success in those places. Not maybe in the first 6 months at all, maybe not even in the first year, but I also have an expectation, and this is where I really, can tell if someone's doing well or not. I have an expectation that the DFOs are going to participate in the leadership and management of the School of Engineering, right? I mean, I rely on them to think not only about their department, but collectively, what are the goals of the school? And if they've figured out their job enough that they can then contribute positively in the school level conversation, that's a successful DFO for me.
Amy, what about you?
So when I had read this question, I wrote down happy staff, happy faculty, happy dean's office. And I think that, I use the word happy, but I think well-functioning, I think as Scott said, if the DFO is a trusted partner with the chair and components of the dean's office, that says a lot. It's really gaining that legitimacy. It's proving yourself so that there is trust. So it's very similar.
It'll often come up. You mentioned, working with some element of the dean's office, right? Every DFO's job is different, and everybody's, first year or so is different. But there's always going to be something that kind of happens, perhaps out of the ordinary, or pick facilities, right? You have a catastrophe. You have a flood. Whatever that is, right? I mean, the DFO isn't expected to know how to fix the flood, but the DFO's expected to be able to know what the problems are, articulate the needs of the faculty, work with the facilities professionals, right? And if that works, right, then that's a good sign of success.
So that success factor is, you want there to be less chaos in the academic unit, not more.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Steve, we'll wrap on your perspective. What
Well, I'm glad Scott said it's fuzzy, because it is fuzzy. I mean, that's a tough question, because it's pretty nuanced out there in the departments. I would say, in addition to what both of you said, having the respect of the faculty too, the trust and all that, and I guess striking that balance between being a creative get to yes problem solver and being able to, stand up when needed and to kind of draw a line and say, no, that's not going to work in a respectful way. I mean, that's a tough thing to do. It's tough for us to do in our
Actually,
jobs.
we haven't talked at all about that.
What's that?
The ability to say no. We need these people to be able to say no in a respectful way.
But, it's an interesting thing. You don't just want to say no. You want to try to get to yes.
Get to yes.
But I think that, and that's why it's so fuzzy, but you kind of get a sense of, in other words, when I talk to the chairs, that's usually when I know. And it's not always because they say, oh, it's great. but it's why they say it's great, is usually how I know if somebody's really thriving there or if they're just.
If there's no tension between the administration and the faculty, then you know actually they're not doing all the parts of their job.
They're not doing quite
Right.
something. It's great when the chair says, I really disagreed with him or her, but in the end, thank goodness, I, ended up listening.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
So I think, and the other thing that's interesting is I think they're doing a great job over time when I see their staff grow, develop, and then get excellent jobs and become a DFO. But that's the very thing that their chairs and faculty will say they're not doing their jobs because they can't
They can't
good
retain
people.
staff.
And so this is why it's this is nuanced. But I would say that's the other thing is when you see people who are developing their staff and actually encouraging them to see those growth opportunities. That's someone who kind of I think about what's the next step for that person. Right?
That's a good people manager, right?
Yep.
So
Challenging,
Right.
but it's tough because when you're down in the trenches, that's precisely what the department, the fact they don't
They
want to
don't
see.
want to see, yeah, exactly. Well, on that note, I want to go ahead and wrap up and just really thank you, the three of you, for your time. I really appreciate it. I think there's a lot of fantastic insight. Amy, as you pointed out, there are certainly many things we probably didn't talk about that we didn't get to, either in terms of just kind of skill, capabilities, or retains this role. I know that this could be an ongoing conversation for quite some time, and we still wouldn't cover everything that just as we did with the DFOs in our time with them. But really appreciate all your insights. I think that this will go a really long way in terms of just kind of shedding a lot of light on this role and how kind of one might approach this role. And so again, fantastic information. Also want to take the time to thank the ongoing collaboration between our three HR leaders at Earth, HNS, and Engineering. So Sue Crutcher at Earth, Sumitra Krishnan over in HNS, and Ember Pickens in School of Engineering. Really appreciate their efforts to continue to support the Day in the Life series. So certainly looking forward to continuing the series as well. If you did tune in and you have a question that just comes up and we weren't able to get to it, certainly you'll want to go ahead and submit those to us. We're going to have a follow-up communication. You can respond that way as well. But we will get replies to those questions that went unanswered. We also would love your feedback as well. So we'll have a follow-up communication that's going to have a link for a survey. We're always looking to improve this series because we want to keep it going. So if you have any input, we certainly would appreciate that. So thank you again to my guests. Really appreciate your time. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Take care.